All right. I would like to just pass this over to Carol Decker, who is a West Newbury resident and also a very active member of the West Newbury Wild and Native Group. Thank you, Carol.
Well, thank you, Corinne. And a special thank you to you and the West Newbury G.A.R. Memorial Library for hosting this important program with West Newbury Wild and Native. We are a group of residents from not only West Newbury, but lots of our adjoining towns, and we're passionate about promoting native plants, pollinators, and wildlife-friendly gardening, as well as controlling invasive plants. We are very pleased to welcome Emily May, a biologist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, for this important talk on the effect of pesticides on pollinators and wildlife. Emily is a Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the Xerces Society's Pesticide program. She received her Master's of Science in Entomology from Michigan State University and has studied pollinator habitat restoration, bee nesting habitats, and the effects of pest management practices on wild bee communities. And before we got on, we had a very interesting discussion of Emily in the field yesterday, looking at actually acquiring pollen from not only wild bees, but from, I should say, some of the honeybees, and looking at the neonicotinoids. You know, I reached out to Emily for a program on pesticides as there's so much misinformation about lawn fertilizers, neonicotinoids used in the ornamental plant industry, the chemicals used to spray plant pests at home, lawn pesticides, and on and on. We have lots of gardeners, and Emily has so much information to share with us on this critical topic. So welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much, Carol, for having me, and to the library for hosting. I'm really excited to talk to you today about effects of pesticides. Well, I'm not excited about the effects of pesticides part, but how do we build a healthy garden ecosystem and protect pollinators and other wildlife from the effects of pesticides. So I'll give you a brief intro to pollinators, how pesticides pose risks to pollinators, some of the hidden risks of pesticides in our residential and garden settings, and then how we can work on minimizing those risks in the way that we manage our yards and gardens. Let's see here. So if you're not familiar with my organization, the Xerces Society, we are a nonprofit organization that focuses on protecting the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. Invertebrates, or spineless animals, are essential to the natural world as we know it. They represent over 95% of animal biodiversity and play really critical roles, including helping break down organic matter, keeping pest populations in check, serving as food for other wildlife, and pollinating crops and wildflowers. So among the many services that are provided mainly by insects is pollination, which is critical for wild ecosystems, managed ecosystems, and our diet. So there's lots of different animals that visit flowers, usually for sugary nectar, and end up pollinating those plants, including butterflies and moths, flies, beetles, wasps, and birds. But out of the many animals that visit flowers, bees are kind of the VIPs, the very important pollinators. Lots of animals on that previous slide are visiting flowers for a quick hit of nectar, but bees are actively collecting and moving pollen around to bring it back to their nests and feed their babies with it. Bees also have behaviors that make them really good pollinators. They tend to exhibit what's called flower constancy, which is meaning that they'll tend to visit the same kind of flower over and over again because it's more efficient for them than learning how to get pollen out of a new flower, which is great news for the plant because it means that the bee is bringing them mostly pollen from that same kind of plant instead of clogging them up with other kinds of pollen. Bees are a super diverse group of insects. There are, I would say, over 350 species in Massachusetts, maybe even closing in on 400. And there are 10 times that number across the United States, nearly 3,600 different species of native bees across the US. And they come in all shapes and sizes and colors. Different bees carry pollen on different parts of their bodies, which can be related to the type of flower that they've evolved to pollinate. Some of them carry pollen dry on their legs, under their bellies, or all over their bodies. The diversity of pollinators, shapes, sizes, where they have pollen collecting hairs, how long their tongues are, all of those features are really echoed and reflected back in the diversity of our native plant shapes and structures, where they offer their nectar and pollen, how those are accessed by a pollinator and transferred around when a pollinator lands on or crawls into or hovers in front of a flower. So each one of these flowers has a different kind of pollinator story to tell. When most people think of a bee, they think about a honeybee. The honeybee is a single species of bee that's important for US agriculture and for people who like honey, bakers, tea drinkers, all kinds of people that have honey in their diets. The honeybee is a managed species that was introduced from Europe. So it's not at risk of extinction because it is managed kind of like livestock. Beekeepers have this really close relationship with these animals. And so these bees have some of the best documentation in the country. Hive losses of honeybees and impacts on their health have been this canary in the coal mine for understanding what's happening with all of our pollinators. But most of the more than 3,600 species of native bees in the US live quite differently from honeybees. So the vast majority of them, about 2/3 overall, and maybe more so up in the Northeast, live underground with only small holes that have any indication that those bees are living there. Some of them live above ground in tunnels in pithy plant stems, like this small carpenter bee living in a blueberry cane. Some of them live in old snags and deadwood. And about 1% of our native bees, the bumblebees, form small colonies in cavities, which could be above or below ground. They're commonly looking for something like an old rodent hole that they can make their nest in. Often that comes with some kind of nice insulation from the rodents that used to live there. So there's a good amount of evidence suggesting that on the whole, we're seeing declines in abundance and diversity of our pollinating species due to a lot of the same kinds of stressors that threaten other kinds of wildlife: habitat loss, use of pesticides, diseases and competition from non-native species, and climate change. So each one of these things is something that we can work to address in our yards and gardens. There are three basic things that all pollinators need: food, shelter, and refuge from pesticides. So food for bees would be nectar and pollen. Food for a butterfly species or moth species would be their host plant. And then there's shelter for nesting and overwintering sites for these animals. So you need that kind of healthy habitat to provide places for them to thrive. And then to keep it healthy, you have to protect it from pesticides. So I could give you a whole other talk on the good elements of a pollinator garden, but I'm going to assume that many of you are already on that path if you're planting native. So I'm going to talk mostly about pesticides today, which are one of the primary drivers of insect decline and have been linked with declines in birds as well. Birds, vast majority of birds consume insects at some point in their lives. So before I talk pesticides, I just want to take a step back and think critically about why and how we use the word pest. People have this tendency to want to categorize everything as good or bad. And what I think a lot of us don't realize is that most insects are at their worst neutral, and many of them are actually directly beneficial to humans or really important for food webs. Less than 2% of described insect species even have the potential to be pests. So, and even those species that can be a pest can also be beneficial. Many are food sources for other insects. But most of the chemicals that we're using for insect, disease, or weed management are harmful to more than just their target species. So for clarity, when I say pesticide, I'm using it not to mean just insecticides or things that are designed to kill insects, but all things that kill living organisms. So it's this umbrella term covering herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, rodenticides, avicides, etc. So pesticide meaning all sides. And to give you a little bit of regulatory context, pesticides in the United States are regulated by the US Environmental Protection Agency, which is the main agency that's charged with regulating registering, reviewing pesticides. And that's governed by the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, as we call it. That's the main act governing pesticide regulation and use. So it involves some level of tolerance of risk in the way that that legislation is crafted. So the protection standard that EPA is given is no unreasonable adverse effects of the use of a pesticide that they register. What that means is that there's some level of reasonable adverse effects. So it's weighing this economic benefit of pesticide use against potential adverse effects. So things get registered and used that have known harm, but there's some level of cost benefit that's gone into that. On the other hand, the Endangered Species Act, which also intersects with pesticides, that standard is to ensure against jeopardy of listed species. So if you have an endangered species, the mandate there is to ensure that that species is not going to be lost, but only a very small fraction of species are protected by that standard. Most of them are under the no unreasonable adverse effects standard. That's just important for knowing that pesticides are registered knowing that they have harm to wildlife and the environment. When we think about pesticides, we often think about agricultural spaces, but there are about 60 million pounds of pesticides used in residential areas in the United States, representing a quarter of all insecticide use. So these spaces are getting a fair amount of insecticide use. And in fact, more pesticides are used per acre in urban areas than in agricultural areas. So in our communities, pesticides are often used for cosmetic reasons to maintain manicured landscapes. They can wash off from grass and patios, impervious surfaces, and end up in our waterways. So data from water sampling from the US Geological Survey found that 61% of rivers in agricultural areas contained pesticides that were at levels risky to aquatic life, 61% in ag areas. And then in urban areas, 90% of sampled urban streams and rivers contain levels of pesticide risky for aquatic life. So it's something that we need to be thinking about and aware of in our own communities. But how are pollinators exposed to these pesticides? So risk also has a specific definition, pesticide risk, and it's a function of two things. The toxicity of the pesticide, so how harmful it is to a particular pollinator, and then exposure, so the level of exposure or the dose that a pollinator receives as they go about their lives. So how are pollinators exposed in gardens? They might be sprayed directly, which is particularly an issue if plants are sprayed when they're flowering. They can also be exposed by visiting flowers that were previously sprayed. Some pesticides don't break down immediately. Some of them are quite long-lived, meaning a pollinator might come into contact with residues even if the spray happened days or weeks prior. So some bees line their nest with mud or leaves, and they might collect nest materials from plants that have been treated or contain residues in them. So if leaves or soil are contaminated, bees could be exposed for a long time in their nests. Or if a butterfly's caterpillar is feeding on its host plant and its host plant is contaminated, that can be a long period of exposure. And then there are systemic pesticides, or water-soluble pesticides that get taken up into plants. They work by being absorbed into plants and moving inside plant tissue. And this is something where we would have concern for flower visitors because they can end up in pollen and nectar. And they could also be present in leaf tissue that's being eaten by a caterpillar of a native butterfly species, right? So there's lots of different ways that pollinators can be exposed to pesticides once they are applied. And when a pesticide is persistent and highly toxic, this means there could be a long period of risk for those organisms visiting and feeding on the plant or excavating their nest in the soil. So I'm guessing many of you have heard of neonicotinoid insecticides. They are a class of pesticides that have a particular combination of characteristics that make them particularly high risk to pollinators. Most neonics are highly toxic to bees by both contact exposure, so on the outside of their bodies, as well as oral exposure, so when they consume it in pollen and nectar. On the exposure side, these insecticides pose real challenges. So they are systemic, they're water soluble, they move into and through plant tissues and can end up in pollen and nectar. They are persistent, sometimes remaining at harmful levels in woody plants and soil for months to years after they were applied. Untreated plants that grow in areas that were formerly treated with these chemicals, such as cover crops following a rotation of treated corn or soybeans, can pick up residues from the prior applications. And they're used really ubiquitously in agriculture as well as in urban areas. So this figure on the right is showing the increase in neonicotinoid use by crop from 1992 to 2014, which is really a massive increase for a short period of time. And it's understandable, that neonics and the risks that they pose to pollinators have kind of dominated the conversation about pesticides and pollinators over the last decade. But turns out neonics are not the only pesticides that pose risk to pollinators, and they're not even close to the only systemic pesticides that end up in plants. There are a variety of systemic pesticides that could pose risks to insects feeding on nectar, pollen, contaminated plant tissue. So these insecticides fall on a range of what we call systemic activity. So how far they can move, how water soluble they are. Some of them are just locally systemic within a plant, and some of them can move throughout the entire plant. The other concern with systemics is really that once they've been taken up by a plant, they're generally more protected from sunlight, UV breakdown, the other things that degrade pesticides in the environment. And so they're more stable and persistent. So systemics that are injected into trees, for example, can persist for really long periods of time, up to several years. So the trouble with systemics and pesticides in general is that once they're applied, they're present, but they're invisible, right? They aren't like a can of paint where you see them in the environment after they've been used. Pesticides can be harming insects with very little notice. I did want to point out, we developed a database of systemic insecticides. So if you're curious about some of these other pesticides with systemic activity, you can go look them up in that database, and it says sort of how toxic they are, what are they used on, how long did they last in the environment. So that was not available before, so we went out and developed the resource. So let's talk about some of the hidden risks from that invisible pesticide use. So maybe you had a tree that was struggling. This is a common thing, calling up a tree doctor or an arborist for some kind of problem in a woody plant. And that person might inject or otherwise treat the tree with a systemic fungicide or an insecticide. The most common class of systemic insecticides is the neonicotinoids that I mentioned, which tick a lot of the red flag boxes for pollinator risk: high toxicity, persistent, in widespread use. So blossoms and leaves from those types of applications can be still contaminated even the year after an application. There was a study by a pesticide manufacturer actually that found rhododendron blooms and leaves were contaminated with bee toxic levels of neonicotinoids the year after a soil drench application. Another hidden risk of insecticide use of systemic insecticides is perimeter and foundation treatments for control of termites and carpenter ants. Some of those products are very similar to the neonics. There's a chemical in Termidor is fipronil. And recently we sampled milkweed from a number of different kinds of sites to see what kind of pesticides were ending up in milkweeds, potentially affecting monarchs. And there was one home that had not applied pesticides in the last 6 years, but the milkweed that had been planted around their foundation was contaminated with concerning levels of an insecticide commonly used for structural pests. And so we found out that the current owner, who moved in 6 years ago, at the time that right before they moved in, the home had been treated for ants or termites. And so shortly after moving in, they planted the milkweed. And then 6 years later, that milkweed was still getting concerning levels of that structural pesticide use in the plant. So pollinator attractive plants around the exterior of houses could be a source of pesticide exposure if those homes got a foundation drench of a systemic insecticide. This actually also just recently happened to my parents, and we've been working through moving the pollinator attractive plants away from the foundation of the house and replacing them with things that don't attract pollinators, unfortunately, in those areas because of an application for carpenter ants. Another place that you might not be thinking about that could pose risk to pollinators are for lawn treatments. So grubs in lawns are generally beetle larvae that feed on grass roots. And some of the chemical options for grub control are pretty high risk for pollinators. Some of them are neonicotinoids. There's also a diamide insecticide, chlorantraniliprole, which is really common as a lawn grub treatment. Chlorantraniliprole is less toxic than neonics to bees, but it can be up to 500 times more toxic to monarch butterfly caterpillars, and it's also systemic. So the unfortunate part of these lawn treatments is that these chemicals that move with water, these systemic insecticides, do not stay where they're put. So if you have pollinator plants, let's say milkweeds, close to a lawn, a systemic grub treatment could move into pollinator plants around the lawn and pose harm. So definitely something to be aware of if you're gardening for pollinators. And we would really love to see individuals and parks moving away from the use of these kinds of lawn grub treatments. So we've done some other testing of milkweeds, including milkweeds sourced from retail nurseries. And we found that those were also almost universally contaminated with a variety of pesticides, including the systemic insecticides that can be found throughout the plant. And it's really so frustrating to think that you might be out there trying to source native plants for your pollinator garden, only to be bringing home plants that might actually harm some of the insects you're trying to protect. So we developed a couple of guides, one for consumers and one for nursery managers on pollinator-friendly nursery practices to help you have a conversation with your local nursery about the kinds of practices and the kinds of pesticides they might be using, and what you're looking for and expecting as a consumer that's looking for bee-safe native plants. So one thing that's good about this is that I've heard many people tell me that they've been able to bring their concerns to the attention of their local nursery and see actual changes in pesticide use or plant sourcing as a result. So it's definitely worth a shot and a conversation. So insecticides pose the most obvious danger to pollinators because they were designed to kill insects, but other types of pesticides can also have effects on pollinators and other wildlife. So one of the other really common pesticide groups are fungicides. Those are pesticides that kill mildews and similar fungi that damage plants, and they're used widely in agriculture as well as in urban landscapes. They're typically the most abundant type of pesticide that's found in bumblebee and honeybee hive material. So bees that are exposed to fungicides appear to be more vulnerable to certain kinds of pathogens, most likely due to fungicides disturbing their gut microbiome. So fungicide can wipe out, the microflora in their gut, which makes them more vulnerable to some of these gut pathogens. And that use of certain fungicides and the presence in these hive materials where the bees are developing on fungicide contaminated bee bread and that kind of thing has been linked to declines in a few bumblebee species. Some fungicides can also effectively multiply the toxicity of some insecticides. So if a bee is getting exposed to a cocktail of different things in the environment, if they're getting exposed to a fungicide and then a certain type of insecticide, they might be seeing more impacts from that combination. And unfortunately, these kind of subtle harmful effects are not assessed in the body of research that's required to register a pesticide. So there's a lot of harms that are not evaluated as part of the decision process that EPA uses to say, yeah, we're going to go ahead and register this pesticide for use. Typically, they're being considered on a chemical by chemical basis and not paying attention to all the ways that these chemicals actually interact in the environment. So we have a fact sheet on fungicide impacts on pollinators that's available on our website if you want to learn more about this. Herbicides, which kill plants, are also in very widespread use in agriculture and residential areas, as well as in native and natural areas for invasive plant management. And the main impact of herbicide use is loss of flowering plants, right? They kill flowering plants that provide food and shelter for pollinators, especially across the millions of acres where these herbicides are being used in agriculture. They are generally lower toxicity compared to other pesticides on contact for pollinators, but there's increasing evidence that, like with fungicides, exposure to herbicides can make bees more vulnerable to other stressors. So many fungicides, many herbicides are systemic, just like the neonics, they end up in the plant. And there's evidence that when herbicides are applied to a flowering plant or just before a plant flowers, they can end up in the nectar of that plant in the window before the plant actually responds to the herbicide and dies. Depends on the herbicide, but this has been found for glyphosate, where if glyphosate is applied to a flowering plant, it can end up at quite high levels in the nectar before the plant dies. So one key mitigation for invasive plant management, it sounded like your group does some of that, is to avoid applying herbicides to plants in bloom. You know, make sure to cut off the flowers if plants are being treated. Thinking about something like Japanese knotweed that's super bee attractive and is sometimes managed during the flowering window. So avoid applying herbicides to plants in bloom because they can end up in that pollen and nectar before the plant responds. One other thing I wanted to mention, in our gardens, we also need to be aware that just because a pesticide is organic doesn't mean it's non-toxic or that it doesn't present some risks to pollinators. I often hear things like, oh, it's just neem oil. Well, neem oil and its active ingredient, an active component azadirachtin, that's an insect growth regulator, which means it has impacts on developing larvae, affects their ability to molt through the different stages of growth. So it's organic. It's not safe for caterpillars or bee larvae. So just something to be aware of. Wouldn't want to use neem oil on a caterpillar host plant, for example. Bt is another common organic pesticide, which is a soil bacterium that produces these crystalline proteins that poke holes in insect stomachs. And different strains of Bt are specific to different groups of insects. So the most common one that's available for organic gardening is a strain that targets Lepidoptera, or butterflies and moths. So that one is practically non-toxic to bees, but it's not safe for butterflies, right? So just to be really aware of the products that are available for use and what they actually affect. So the organic insecticides can be quite toxic in some cases, pyrethrin, spinosad, depending on what insect you're looking at, Bt, neem oil. This doesn't mean that organic pest management in agriculture is on par with conventional pest management or conventional pesticides. Organic standards are a strong and valuable system, and most organic pesticides break down much more quickly in the environment than their synthetic counterparts, which were designed to be more toxic and more persistent in the environment. So a classic piece of misinformation that you'll hear, especially for people looking at backyard mosquito treatments, is that pyrethroids, which are the synthetic relative of pyrethrins, an organic pesticide derived from chrysanthemum flowers, still toxic to bees, but the pyrethroids, the synthetic versions, are much more toxic and persistent in the environment than pyrethrins. So that misinformation that you'll hear is these backyard treatments for mosquitoes are derivatives of chrysanthemum flowers. They're eco-friendly, but really the synthetic versions are what's in common use, and they are not equivalent to the organic original, as they last quite a bit longer in the environment. So now that you know all of that, let's talk about how we address pesticides in yards and gardens. Protecting pollinators from pesticides isn't just about making sure that a product doesn't have warning sign for bees. An important first step is really not considering pesticides to be the first line of defense for things that are happening in your yard. So we want to be seeing more gardeners using prevention first management and eliminating pesticide use for cosmetic reasons. So we're going to talk about what this prevention first approach looks like. And this is what some people might call ecological pest management, and then walk through building a functional and resilient system, how to respond when something seems out of balance. So all of these things take time. And the big picture message I have here is that patience is key, and that there's ways that we can reframe how we think about and how we approach seeing insects in our gardens. So talking about building a healthy ecosystem in our gardens, the bottom of this is really the foundation of this is an ounce of prevention saves a pound of cure. So prevention is really the foundation. Building a resilient ecosystem starts with good planning and design, choosing the right plants for the right place, building healthy soils, increasing plant and beneficial insect diversity, and then spacing plants out so that they receive good sunlight and airflow. Diverse plantings tend to be a lot more resilient to damage and stressors than big monocultures. Supporting beneficial insects is a big part of this. So many insects that eat or parasitize pests will use the diverse habitat that you plant. Attracting and supporting species that prey on pests is called conservation biological control. And learning to recognize and promote some of these natural enemy species can help prevent pests from becoming a problem. Some of the common ones that you might find are things like ground beetles, assassin bugs, minute pirate bugs, lacewings, predatory wasps, and spiders. So green lacewings eat nectar and pollen as adults. The larvae feed on things like mites and eggs and small insects like aphids. Predaceous ground beetle adults eat soil-dwelling insects like cutworms and root maggots. So it's great as an opportunity to kind of identify a few common pest species as well as beneficial species that you might be supporting in your yards. Other things that are involved with preventive management are choosing species or varieties that are well suited for your local conditions. So in the garden, that might mean choosing vegetable varieties that are resistant or tolerant of certain pathogens. Tomatoes, as an example, are really susceptible to a variety of things like late blight and early blight. And if those have been an issue in your garden, you can look for varieties that have more resistance going forward. Cornell University has a really good, is a great source of info on resistant varieties. In perennial plants, there are sometimes horticultural varieties that are more resistant, but in that case, it's more about really planning out a resilient wildflower planting with species that are well adapted to your local condition. And it's more about choosing the species rather than the varieties that are tolerant of the local conditions. Prevention is also about soil health, making sure you have good drainage, checking nutrient levels and pH. So you can take a soil sample and send it in for testing. I think UMass Amherst offers that. And you can learn a lot from a good soil test. And then finally, one thing that we often get wrong in our gardens is watering. So you want to water wisely, not too much, not too little. And overhead sprinklers tend to water just the top inch or two of soil and promote shallow root growth. So if you're wanting to promote the deeper root growth so that plants are better able to withstand heat and drought stress in the summer, using a soaker hose or a drip line and letting that water soak in deeply can make those plants a little more resilient later on in the season. The next step in active prevention is cultural and physical control, things like barriers and mulches. In a vegetable garden, it might be floating row covers. If you have, tend to get a lot of flea beetles or cabbage loopers or things like that, early season cucumber beetles on cucurbits. In perennial beds, mulches can be a simple addition for weed control and moisture retention. One practice I like to use in wildflower beds, though, is to leave some spaces unmulched, just to make sure that bees that nest in the ground have adequate space available. So if they wanted to nest in the back of the garden bed, they could do so. Other preventive steps include pruning to improve airflow, using trap crops to attract and manage insects that might otherwise become pests. So you could plant, as one example, a row of lovage on either side of tomatoes to try and attract tomato hornworms before they get to the tomatoes. So it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Each crop attracts a specific set of pests, but they can fit into a home garden setting and can be an interesting way to try and get some of that preventive management. But problems do arise even in the most well-planned vegetable gardens. So when you've put so much elbow grease into building a productive space, it can be frustrating to see your plants suffering from some kind of insect, pest, or disease. And so this is just, I'm going to talk through kind of the general process for approaching any kind of something that seems out of balance. So the first step is just documenting what you're seeing. So are you seeing insects, plant damage, or other symptoms? Sometimes the most obvious issue is plant damage and you don't actually see insects. So you can look closely at it and see whether there's evidence of frass, insect frass is insect poop, webbing, mining trails, that kind of thing. Are you seeing spotted or browning or curling leaves? And these days, a smartphone can be a really useful tool in the garden. So taking good photos that help identify the specific issue, taking notes on when the problem developed, what kind of symptoms you saw, how many insects are present. All of these kinds of things will help in identifying the issue and choosing how to manage it. Sometimes it's not actually an issue. We'll talk about that more. As an observant gardener, and I'm sure you all are as well, I tend to notice when things go awry or out of balance. So when I was living in Connecticut, I one year spotted deformed flower heads on my purple coneflower, and I was curious what was going on and what I could do about it. So in order to manage pests and diseases, you need to know life cycles and you need to know habitat needs. So it's really important to know exactly what you have before you make any decisions about management. Just because something is eating your plants doesn't mean it's harmful. It could be beneficial in some way because you have to have caterpillars in order to have butterflies and moths. So in this case, I could see dark webbing and frass. If you look here, webbing and frass in between the bracts of that coneflower, which indicated it was likely an insect pest. I couldn't see the culprit, but after I pulled a couple of flower heads apart, I spotted this brown and tan striped caterpillar. So what was it? Not everybody has an entomology degree, but there's lots of other resources that can help with identifying. So online resources, things like your local cooperative extension or master gardener hotline, state diagnostic laboratory. You have to be careful about overinterpreting from an internet search, but it's a great first start, as well as apps like iNaturalist and bugguide.net, where you have communities of experts that can help provide photo identification of insects. So I was able to identify my caterpillars through an internet search. I had a general idea of what I should be looking for, but I was able to match the description of the damage on the coneflower as well as the image of the caterpillars that I'd found. So I had sunflower moth caterpillars feeding on the pollen and immature seeds of my purple coneflower. So whatever you found in your garden, just like in parenting, sometimes it's good to take a little pause before you intervene. A first step would be to check that the plant has what it needs. Does it have water, nutrients, the right pH, airflow, and spacing? Stressed out plants tend to look a lot worse and have a difficult time mustering defenses against some kind of infection. So one example is blossom end rot in tomatoes, which looks like a fungal disease, actually is the result of calcium deficiency in the soil. So just make sure you know what you have and that your plants have what they need. And then a second pause to think about intentions. It can help you decide what kind of level of damage or infestation you're comfortable with. Are you trying to conserve insects and create wildlife habitat? Are you dependent on the fruits and vegetables that you're growing? Are you trying to bring a certain aesthetic to your space? So in crops, researchers can provide thresholds for intervening based on economics, when it makes sense to take action against a pest to prevent yield loss. In home gardens, economic thresholds don't really work. Generally, we're able to tolerate a lot more damage because our livelihoods are not on the line. So if I think about my own land, I have three main goals: to conserve and support diversity of insects and birds and other wildlife living around me with native flowering plants, to create a beautiful space that I like watching in the morning with my coffee, and given that I have a toddler and a busy life otherwise, to manage land with as little effort as possible. So I want a system that I can build, put some effort up front into, but then have a healthy and functional ecosystem that requires very little intervention from me. So all of these things help me to take a pause before making any moves in the garden. Just because an insect is present and eating your plants doesn't mean it's a problem. So it might be present at a level that's being kept in check by beneficial insects, or it doesn't affect the health of your plants or doesn't threaten the health of your plants. So before I come back to my coneflower example, going to give you another example from my yard. This is Pearly Everlasting, which I planted in one of my pollinator beds, which is the host plant for the American lady and painted lady butterflies. And I was really excited to put it in the garden. And then the next year, after I put it in, it came up again and looked pretty terrible. It was covered in frass. Its leaves were heavily damaged. And I thought, what the heck is going on? That looks so bad. But then I looked closer and it was teeming with American lady caterpillars. So I let them be, right? That's why I had put it in there in the first place. And then 2 months later, the plants came back and were looking huge and healthy and beautiful. So this plant species has had a relationship with these larval butterflies for much longer than any of us have been alive. So this species can withstand the damage that it's adapted for. And that's true of so many native plants that have these relationships with native insects. They can come back and withstand the damage that they were adapted for. I think about that with eastern tent caterpillars as one example of something that we as people often want to intervene in, but actually those insects are native and have had relationships with tree species for many generations. Gardening for wildlife means rethinking what damage to plants actually means. The presence of caterpillars is not a threshold for intervening. It can actually often mean that you are doing something right? So is your plant being eaten? You can pat yourself on the back because there's wildlife in your garden. There are still times that I might intervene. Big outbreaks of certain insects could reflect an imbalance in the system. When something isn't being kept in check by predators, or maybe I have a non-native insect that doesn't have a natural predator. So the long-term response to that is still to keep increasing plant diversity, to promote beneficial insects, that try to keep the system more in balance. But coming back to the coneflower example, for me, it took significant damage to basically every available flower head before I decided to intervene to try and just retain some of the pollen and nectar resources from that plant for other insect species in the garden. So I don't use pesticides in my yard, but I did decide to just cut and bag some of the most heavily infested flower heads. And I've used a similar method for bee balm, which had a heavy infestation of the raspberry pyrastomos caterpillar. And in response, the plants produced more flower heads, some of which were less damaged and had accessible nectar and pollen for other species. So this was not a big intervention. I wasn't getting rid of every flower head. It was just enough to try and keep some of that in check and make those resources available for other species. For lots of diseases and certain larval infestations, sanitation or the removal of infested plant material is a top choice for reducing the level of damage, breaking the development cycle of that particular insect or disease. So I didn't treat my coneflower plants. I didn't clip off every flower, just the ones that had really signs of heavy damage and lots of frass. For other insect outbreaks, handpicking or squishing or knocking them off with water can be a good first step. Handpicking is tedious, right? I've spent a lot of late nights picking slugs out of the garden off of lettuce, but it is deliberate and it's cautious and saves other wildlife in the garden from harm. Most home gardens can be managed well without pesticides, and I really want to encourage more folks to go pesticide free in your garden. When you have the foundation in place, you can really accept that lots of different insects might be using your garden, sometimes in ways that you don't love, and that's okay. The whole attitude towards gardening can shift. But we recognize that not everyone is in that place yet. Maybe there's a prized plant like your grandmother's rose bush that you can't imagine letting go of, and it's being threatened by an insect outbreak or disease. So if pesticides are part of your management, we want you to consider using them only when something is really threatening the survival of a plant, and only when you've taken preventive or non-chemical steps to try and deal with it. So please seek out information on the toxicity of the product you're using to both people and pollinators, keeping in mind that there's a lot of deceptive marketing. We have resources available to help with this, which you can find in our publications database at xerces.org. Just search for pesticides. And we're also happy to help if you have questions and want to reach out. So before I wrap up, I am going to have some I guess, positive solutions to the doom and gloom of pesticides. I did want to provide a little bit of information for folks on mosquito and tick management because that's something I get a lot of questions about. So the typical conventional backyard treatments for mosquitoes are pyrethroid insecticides, which are highly toxic to bees and a variety of other insects. Some pest control companies, as I mentioned, use misleading language to downplay the risks of these chemicals, falsely claiming that they are derived from natural sources. But the collateral damage from these sprays can extend to insects that are nesting or foraging in or near the treated yard, as well as those that come visit or lay eggs on plants in or near that yard in the following weeks. So we've been trying to do some residue sampling studies to understand how far these residues are traveling from backyard applications and vector control district applications, and what we can do to better protect our pollinator gardens from the impacts of drift from these types of applications. So for example, if you have a neighbor that is firmly set on applying these mosquito treatments and can't be convinced otherwise, you might consider planting some conifers, some evergreens between your yard and theirs to try to help catch that drift if you have pollinator plantings close to a neighbor that is applying these pyrethroids. The worst part about this, at least in my perspective, is that for mosquitoes, these single yard treatments really aren't effective. Mosquitoes can fly, they can quickly repopulate a treated yard from the community sources of mosquito breeding. So it's an expensive treatment that has impacts on pollinators and pets, and in some cases, potentially people, and it doesn't even work very well. So reducing mosquito encounters happens at an individual level, from personal protection in the form of clothing and repellents, and then as well as source reduction, so removal of standing water. A mosquito can breed in an amount of water that's the size of a bottle cap. So really being careful about checking gutters, checking, kids' toys, checking old flower pots to find any sources of standing water and remove them, and limiting mosquito production by draining that water out. And this can be happening at the backyard level as well as at the community level. You can also work with your town or county or vector control district to think about how to support and encourage healthy wetlands with mosquito predators like dragonflies, and use an ecologically sound pest management framework for mosquito management, focusing really on that source reduction, surveillance, and control of larval mosquitoes before they reach adulthood. So that's a lot of information. The one thing I also wanted to mention is that some of you may have heard of the larval dunk trap that Doug Tallamy has talked about, which is an alternative control method for single yards that makes use of the mosquito-specific or fly-specific Bt pesticide in a trap that doesn't appear to attract bycatch of other insects. So basically what this is, you take a 5-gallon bucket of water, you put it in a sunny place in your yard, add a handful of hay or straw, and after a few days, that brew is very attractive to gravid female mosquitoes. And so the mosquitoes lay their eggs in there, and then there's a mosquito dunk tablet containing this Bt larvicide that you can add to the bucket. The eggs hatch, the larvae don't make it. So this is a way to control mosquitoes without the use of insecticides that harm a broad spectrum of other insects. So this should never be used in water that drains elsewhere, like into a pond. It should only be used in containers. But this is photos from an Audubon chapter blog, and they have added a top that just makes sure that very little else gets into that bucket, and doesn't affect other insects. Mosquito females still make their way in there. The final thing I'll mention here is on tick management, since I also get questions on this. The best thing we can do for ticks is employ personal protection. The area of highest risk for encountering ticks is that ecotone between a wooded edge into the lawn. Forests are the largest source for nymphal ticks in residential landscapes in the Northeast, particularly if you have a dense wooded understory with Japanese barberry, which is a shrub that attracts tick hosts. So steps to minimize tick encounters are personal protection, like permethrin-infused clothing, which is it's an insecticide, but it's bound tightly to the fabric of the clothing. That is what I use in my own yard. I actually just had to take doxycycline 2 weeks ago for a tick bite that I got in my yard. So I'm back on my permethrin-infused clothing and personal protection. The other thing to consider is establishing a xeric border between a forest edge and the area of lawn or garden that you're in most frequently. So something like wood chips or gravel, a couple feet of that between where you might have overhanging grass or wooded shrubs coming out of a forest edge and your lawn. So keep that recreational area mowed short. These are all ways to avoid the application of a barrier or a yard treatment for ticks. So that's all to say that pesticides can pose risks, but there are solutions for our gardens, and that you are all playing an important role in those solutions by native plant gardening. So habitat is a solution in its own way to pesticide exposure. Maybe you've already taken steps to eliminate pesticide use in your yard and garden, but you're worried about what your neighbors are doing. You're worried about what's happening in the community. So I did want to offer you the hope that there is increasing evidence that bees that have access to abundant and diverse food sources are much better equipped to deal with the effects of pesticide exposure. So good nutrition is reducing the impacts of pesticide exposure. Just like healthy diets help us keep our immune system tuned up, good nutrition can help reduce the impacts of pesticides on pollinators. So the work that you do to provide pollinators with pesticide-free food and shelter is so important. And as you get deeper into the work, you can also help to engage neighbors and community to talk about how to shift practices around you as well. We have a lot of community-focused resources at our Bee City USA website. And so I know I'm getting close to the end here. I just wanted to wrap up by talking about the power of observation and incremental progress in ecological gardening. So if you're used to mowing and bagging and cleaning, it can take a shift in perspective to get used to that native aesthetic. And getting curious and observant really helps. Just watching the plants in your yard, how they're doing, what they're attracting, what conditions they seem to thrive in, looking at other plants nearby, what grows well, what buzzes with life around your community is a better indication of how well that plant is going to do in your yard than how good it looked on the day that you saw it in the nursery. So this is a case where it's totally encouraged to be a nosy neighbor. And I've made several friends around the neighborhood by asking about their plants. It really helps when you're wanting to go clean something up to just think about what life you see there. Take a minute and just watch the bumblebees on the aster and the goldenrod, what you might not see hidden under the thatch, and just let it live and enjoy the buzz and hum of life in the garden. Watching your plants and what visits them is part of this continuous process of evaluating what's working and what's not working. And so maybe you can't make every change that you want every year, but just doing it in easy to do chunks. My front yard started with a few pollinator plants and a lot of mowed grass. And my goal is just to take out more grass every year. Take time to enjoy what you've created and find what plants give you that kind of amazing hum and buzz in the garden. As you build more diversity into your yards and garden, bit by bit, that ripples up through the food web to create this full and functional system that supports far more life. Our vision is really a future where all landscapes, towns and cities, farms and natural areas can enjoy thriving, abundant, and diverse invertebrate populations, which takes solutions at all scales, including at the scale of gardeners, farmers, and other land managers, as well as broader regulatory solutions. Managing gardens without pesticides can feel like a big ask, but the long-term payoff is greater ecological and human health. So I hope that you'll take all of this to heart as you work to conserve pollinators and other wildlife in your own communities. I would visit our website for lots of resources on lots of different topics on pesticides and pollinators and other insects. This is a library of decades of work. So if you're interested and you're not finding a resource that's, that you would really like to know more about, I would encourage you to contact us because we're always trying to fill in the gaps on those kinds of resources that you're looking for. So thanks so much for having me. And I'll stop there.
Emily, thank you so very much. Oh my goodness. I love the hum and the buzz in the garden. And it's doing those little bits. I also liked what you said about um by having these strong native plants, we can really help the bees, our native bees, be stronger in their own defense against some of these pesticides. So yeah, just
Yeah, just
much.
one example of that that is coming out of UMass Amherst researchers' work is that plants in the sunflower family have this pollen that's kind of spiky. And so having plants available in the sunflower family can help bees actually clear out some of the gut pathogens that they have in their systems. So they consume that pollen, and then that spiky pollen grain comes through their gut and helps them clear out pathogens that have made a home in there. So it's helping with it's almost like taking a tonic to help them with some of these gut pathogens. So it's just one example. That's one we know about, but I'm sure that having other plants and the diversity of native plants can provide similar benefits.
Oh, that's fascinating. Are there any questions from our participants? Anything burning? You covered so many topics, so it was wonderful.
I have a question. I wonder, this is kind of putting you on the spot a little, but I wonder if you have like an effective soundbite for someone who is really married to their lawn. Someone who's, this is all like wah, 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 and they just care about their lawn. Do you have, a couple sentences that I could say to try to change that person's perspective?
Oh, that's
I know
after
it's
just
hard.
giving an hour-long talk. Sometimes I struggle with getting it condensed down into just a couple sentences. Um, I mean, I think the main thing, lawns are, I think everything should have a clear purpose. So lawns have a purpose of looking a certain way, but they don't do anything for other wildlife, right? So if we're looking to conserve all of the wildlife around us that is struggling, we need to be building in plant diversity. So we don't have to get rid of all of our lawns. If you really like the aesthetic of a lawn, you can keep part of a lawn, especially if it is also used for some kind of recreational purpose. Maybe you have a toddler that likes kicking a ball around or something. But filling in around the lawn with native plants helps that space become much more vibrant and part of the local ecosystem instead of taking away from it.
Yeah, that's great. Wait, and thank you for your information on these larval dung traps. I had missed that. So that's just another good one if people are asking and, for mosquito control. That sounds very effective and really so much less toxic. So,
Right. Yeah, it's very contained. And there was a community or two in New Jersey that did some studies on more community-wide implementation of those. So getting a neighborhood where, every few houses they had a dung trap. And it was very effective at reducing adult populations of mosquitoes.
excellent. Emily, thank you so very much again. This is just invaluable information, so much to learn, and you certainly condensed this wide subject down into something that we can all really think about and explore more in the Xerces website. So thank you for all your work in helping us learn more about this subject and really in just all your work with native bees and helping them in the future as we go forward.
Well, thank you for all your work in West Newbury, and I hope everything goes well this summer. Thanks so much for having me. I'm always happy to talk about this, and please do explore the website if you're looking for more resources.
Thank you, everyone.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Corinne. It
much.
was
Yeah,
wonderful.
thank you, Carol. Thank you, Emily. This was fantastic. All right.
Awesome.
Have a nice
Thank
afternoon,
you.
everyone. Thanks for joining us.